Welcome to Medyascope. Today we're here to talk about Libya with Emadeddin Badi, who's here in Istanbul to join a panel organized by IstanPol and Heinrich Böll Stiftung. Mr. Badi is a political analyst at the European University Institute and also a non-resident fellow with the Middle East Institute. Thank you very much for taking your time on the sidelines of this panel. It's never an easy thing to talk about Libya, especially since you're a Libyan with academic background, looking into the issue from various dimensions, from various angles. We have been following what's happening in the country since the NATO-backed operation to oust Muammar Gaddafi back in 2011. Since then, we've seen the country being pulled into a turmoil which has its own dynamics in itself. And recently, it's taken a different shape. But what we see is there seems to be like a power split between Tripoli and Tobruk at the moment. Tripoli being headed by Sarraj, who enjoys support of the government of Turkey extensively at the moment. And on the other hand, you have General Haftar sitting in Tobruk, covering majority of the territory in Libya in terms of control, and being backed by the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, France, United States, all in their various capacities. What can you tell us about this diversion of power and the conflict at the moment on the ground?
Well, in terms of the divergence of power, or the power split, I would trace it back to the 2014 civil war in Libya that sparked the institutional split that we currently have. I would say to a certain extent that was also the result of actually foreign intervention back then, because that didn't necessarily stop with 2011. Foreign states did not stop actually dealing with non-state actors and their own networks directly on the ground. So back in the day, at the time, it was jointly Qatar, Egypt, and predominantly really the UAE that to a certain extent crashed the democratic transition and sparked the civil war of 2014. That was then actually resolved or dealt with by actors within the international community, including Europeans and also Americans, that backed the Khairat agreement, which brought the GNA into existence, the current government. However, the problem is there was this almost two-tier system of policies that was established, one where states would actually back the UN and its track for a political dialogue. The other track was more insidious, more covert, less legal, I would say, in the sense that a lot of states deployed policies about directly dealing with non-state actors, whether it be European states or other states. That included, for example, France and Italy, both of which dealt with actors respectively east and west of the country, but also, for instance, the Emiratis kept backing Haftar, and to a certain extent, Turkey also backed factions that opposed him via Misrata, that opposed Haftar and Benghazi, via Misrata. So that led to the reality that we have today in terms of foreign interventionism, and what we have today is essentially partly the result of this two-tier system that was never really reconciled into one.
Mm-hmm. But when we look at it, it's all about proxies, isn't it? I mean, Turkey is there with, although it's not officially being confirmed, international reports point at the large number of Syrian fighters being flown into the country. On the Russian side, which I forgot to mention, but it's a big power, is like putting more weight into Libya than in previous years. So they are talking about this Wagner, missionaries that Russia does not own, but it's a Russian influenced and paid missionaries. So all these proxies, how is that welcome? How does it mix and interact with the texture of politics in Libya?
Well, I would say that, obviously the proxy dynamic was to a certain extent catalyzed by the offensive that Haftar launched last year on April 4th of 2019, because we didn't have this overt of an involvement from Turkey, this overt of an involvement from Russia on either side of the Libyan conflict. This happened as a result of the offensive. And I don't think we can really speak about proxies in the academic, let's say, sense of the term, because to a certain extent, a proxy would be someone that would essentially act on behalf of that state within the country. And you don't really have that particular dynamic in mind because, for example, in the case of Haftar, it's very difficult to label him a proxy because he has so many backers. So he has managed to navigate that to a certain extent quite well. And that's also partly the reason why he was able to shun the ceasefire that Moscow and Turkey jointly brokered last January, if I'm not mistaken. So it's very difficult to speak about a direct proxy dynamic. However, there is an internationalization of the civil war, and how this plays out in terms of Libyan politics or in terms of the Libyan context, obviously, is that it's compounding divisions. It's making it very difficult to reach a decision that would be Libyan, first of all, because you no longer can reach a decision right now purely based on Libyans' interests. So Libyans can't get to a decision themselves. It was already difficult before April 2019. Now it's even almost impossible. And I think that's part of the reason why actually Germany acknowledged this reality. It was the first time that it was almost acknowledged that we actually now need to sit down as an international community, as players that influence the Libyan landscape, as interveners, really, and host a forum where we would commit to, first of all, stop intervening and then enforcing the arms embargo. Unfortunately, clearly there isn't political will to do that at this stage, neither on Turkey's side nor on the Emirati side. And as a result, there's also very little incentive for domestic parties to do that either, because they are receiving support at the end of the day, and it is a civil war that is quite lucrative to a lot of parties involved.
Okay. Before we get into what actually there is for Turkey or for Russia in Libya, why has there been this escalation, sudden escalation? It's been a couple of months ago that we've seen this, heavy influx of weapons, heavy influx of, manpower. What happened that triggered that immediate response?
You mean in terms of weapons
being sent to Libya? Yeah.
This is something that I personally think was partly a result of Berlin, actually, because essentially by failing or by demonstrating that even collectively Europeans failed to put pressure or coercion on any of the actors involved to stop intervening, it's essentially no holds barred for intervention, and you can do what you want. So, and that's part of the reason why you have more weapons being flown into the country and more mercenaries, etc. I think that's one of the reasons why. The other reason why is also the idea that is prevalent amongst a lot of the Libya players at this stage, at least the influential ones, or the primary influential ones, those would be Turkey and the UAE, really, is that you need to have a new military reality through which we would secure our interests. For the UAE, this means a military win of some sorts for Haftar. For Turkey, this means that the GNA and the wider Tripoli vicinity and certain western areas need to survive or be able to thwart this offensive. And how that manifests itself is not through political talks. It's through shipments of weapons, it's through sending mercenaries, it's through a military approach.
Mm-hmm. So what can we tell about Turkey's interest in Libya? When you look at Turkey right now, there's already a front being fought in Syria, and one that causes, lies in its where Turkish public opinion is focused on. We've seen the intention to move on to Libya emerging, late 2019, and now, the parliament ratified the motion to send troops to Libya. What do you make out of it? Of course, the government in justifying the move, talks about the historical links with Libya, the need to be in Eastern Mediterranean to protect interests of Turkey in Eastern Mediterranean and all that. But what do you make out of it?
Well, I would challenge a bit the idea that Turkey just arrived in 2019 into Libya. Turkey had a presence there since the Gaddafi era, really. Economically, it had a lot of interest way back when, and that partly explains why it intervened, because the type of state that Haftar would establish would be one where Turkey would actually have almost zero benefits out of being from Libya, or let's say zero strategic benefits, because it does have, for example, exports of certain scrap metal exports that through Haftar, with Haftar. But however, in terms of strategic, let's say, or geopolitical footprint, it wouldn't have any in a Haftar-controlled Libya. So that's part of the reason why I think Turkey intervened, and it did that pretty quickly if we look at the timeline of things since April, and overtly as well, because Turkey sent very publicly armored personnel, vehicles, weapons, signaling that it stood not just against Haftar's offensive on the Government of National Accord, but also against his backers, primarily the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Egyptians, but also France. So that's, I think, the geopolitical aspect of why Turkey intervened and why it was that quick. Then, however, what happened, or what we saw, was more of a pragmatic or transactional approach to Turkey's intervention, because it did de facto leverage its military contribution into something else, into a maritime agreement on demarcation, through which it guaranteed its own maritime commercial interests in Libya. So that highlights that the actual incentive for Turkey to intervene wasn't primarily ideological, as a lot of people would put it. It isn't this idea of a neo-Ottoman state. It isn't really a pan-Islamist idea, although these are also there. They exist, and they are reasons behind the intervention, but those are superseded by the commercial, business, economic interests that have more importance, let's say. And I think that's part of the reason why Turkey intervened the way it did. Now, the problem is that Turkey doesn't really have, first of all, the political capital to actually be able to outmaneuver Haftar's backers, who are many at the end of the day, and who have, for example, if we're talking about France has a seat at the United Nations Security Council. It's an influential member within the EU. It's part of the P5. So you're talking about a player that is plugged into different decision-making circles through which it can influence the Libyan landscape. And I think that's part of the reason why the German initiative really, we can argue, it failed to a certain extent. And the other facet is that from an institutional perspective, or from a logistical perspective, it's very difficult for Turkey to actually intervene offensively in Libya without it maybe costing a bit too much. So at this stage, it is a lot more, it's a lot more of a rational decision to establish a defensive setup in and around Tripoli, which is what Turkey did, essentially to thwart this offensive, not recapture the entirety of the Libyan territory. So that's where things stand maybe with regards to Turkey right now.
Yeah, but even in terms of the defensive position, do you think that is sustainable? Because we're talking about all these heavyweights on the other side, you know, in terms of financial power, in terms of technical, in terms of any international alliance that you think of. So is Turkey's position sustainable, or should we see Turkey trying to pull Russia as the counterpart in a possible resolution, as an effort to bypass all these countries as a whole and deal with Russia one-to-one as it does in Syria?
Well, that's almost, let's say, the irony of the Libyan conflict. It's the low cost of almost keeping the conflict brewing, because at the end of the day, despite the wide area of actors on the other side, on Haftar's side, they haven't really committed all that much. It's not a lot of if you look at it comparatively with other, it's not a lot of assets. It doesn't cost a lot to keep the conflict brewing. So essentially what Turkey has done is it deployed mercenaries that are partly doing logistics and partly deployed as combatants, and it also deployed the aerial defense system and weaponry to be able to defend the capital and other western cities, including Misrata, Zawiya, Zuwara, etc. But there's a big question about the sustainability of this setup, dependent on maybe Turkish politics, domestic politics, more than it is on the Libya sphere of things. Because it is clear here, even if you look at the discussions in parliament, etc., that the opposition groups in Turkey really disapprove of this approach. That's partly because of an anti-Erdogan sentiment, possibly, but it is clear that this intervention might not outlive him to a certain extent. So that begs a big question about how sustainable it is beyond 2021, for example, or 2022.
So how about the energy geopolitics, if you look at Turkey's involvement today? Because from left to right, although sending troops to Libya has egged, many circles in Turkey, it is also seen as a logical move that Ankara stepped in to protect Turkey's interests in the Eastern Mediterranean when there are all these drills going on with Cyprus and with Greece and Israel in a way involved in it. So there was this imminent need, they say. If we hadn't moved in on time, we would have lost it. But at the same time, I would like to ask you how again, heavy this memorandum of understanding is in country's future that Turkey can rely on the terms signed on it.
Well, in terms of the memorandum of understanding, I would say that at this stage it is more symbolic than it is practical, let's say, because this doesn't resolve Turkey's issues with Greece. It doesn't resolve Turkey's issues with Cyprus. But from a Turkish perspective, I think what this does is it helps maybe initiate a conversation to actually tackle these issues. Now, obviously, initiating a conversation, that implies that this memorandum of understanding will last and will remain there, which means that Turkey has to save the government of national accord. So that's where the dynamic linking Libya with the Eastern Mediterranean maybe is, and that partly explains why Turkey is so aggressive in its approach to foreign policy. But on the other hand, the problematic aspect of this approach is that it draws in players that weren't really Libya players against Turkey as well. So you have countries like Greece that wasn't really involved in Libya, that has now, for example, hosted Haftar, that is having memorandums with the United Arab Emirates as well. So you have these different geopolitical dynamics that are almost a reaction to this memorandum of understanding, and that signal that parties aren't ready to have a conversation. They don't want to have this conversation, and they're also gambling on a new military reality. Despite, Cyprus or Greece aren't really going to send off weaponry, for example, but they are going to support Haftar diplomatically as much as they can, even if it is a little.
What can we tell about Europe in all this? European Union has been extremely quiet, if not quiet, quite leveled in its involvement. What do you make out of it?
It's a bit frustrating to speak about the EU these days, especially. At this stage, I almost find it redundant, unfortunately, to speak of it as a bloc. The EU has been plagued by divisions when it comes to Libya. That's not something that is really new. From 2011 to 2014, we had this competition for influence between France, the UK, and Italy over Libya. It wasn't really something pernicious, let's say. It wasn't something nefarious. It wasn't causing a lot of damage, but it did undermine the EU as a bloc. The EU was, to a certain extent, always viewed as this neutral player. It was supposed to have a support. It was supposed to, let's say, manage the post-NATO intervention phase. At least that was the US's expectation, who led from behind in terms of the NATO intervention. Unfortunately, it failed to live up to American and Libyans' expectations in terms of doing that. And post 2014, we had, as I said, states that engaged in policies covertly of dealing directly with non-state actors based on their own perceived interests. So you had states like Italy, for example, brokering local deals with non-state actors, with armed groups to stop boats in order not to get waves of migration, motivated partly by popular sentiment in Italy. You had states like France that covertly offered Haftar support. And the problem and the consequence of this is that it has resulted in these ad hoc conferences that were mostly actually done in Europe, like La Celle Saint-Cloud, like Paris, like Palermo, etc., that weren't necessarily tackling the conflict, or they weren't, let's say, actually a genuine effort at having a collective policy, European policy. They kept doing what they were doing, but they just engaged with the process just for the sake of having a process. I think this is the trap that we're getting caught up in now, and I think this is the trap that maybe Germany fell in, albeit not by its own making, but primarily because of EU divisions over Libya and explicitly France's support for Haftar. And this is where we stand at this stage in terms of the EU. Unfortunately, it's very difficult for it to salvage some credibility. The only form of credibility that the EU could have would be if it manages to somewhat come up with a concerted position, which is maybe far-fetched, but also be able to take advantage of the follow-up committees that Berlin has set, these committees that would bring in all the players to talk about things. But again, it's very difficult for it to be able to muster the political capital to affect or influence Libya the way it honestly should. And that brings in why Turkey and Russia maybe become the alternative for a lot of people.
When you look at Syria, and the same frustrations, were also echoed in the Syrian conflict, but it changed when refugees become a major problem.
Regards to Europe, you mean?
Yeah, with European Union especially. So it became an issue when there was this threat of terror attacks in Europe. Yeah. Do you think the same elements would also work in Libya?
It's almost not hypothetical. This is what happened in post 2014, after the bout of civil war that we had. There were waves of migration. There were several terror attacks, including in France, that were attributed or linked with militants that were either trained or linked with Libya, the Libyan landscape per se, and that is what triggered the push for a UN-mediated political dialogue. Unfortunately, what it also triggered is, okay, let's deal with migration through non-state actors, and let's deal with counterterrorism through also dealing with non-state actors, even if it is at the expense of the democratic transition of the country. And that's part of the reason why we have constantly had these cyclical conferences that have basically appeased Haftar until he launched an offensive, completely upending the political process. So it's almost like Europeans got caught in a trap of their own making, unfortunately. So, yeah.
So what do Libyan people think? What do they feel about all this, chaos going on and all the involvement of the international actors in the future of a country that basically belonged to them?
Well, it's very difficult to speak on behalf of Libyans these days, especially
it's very fragmented and tribal in its own way. But
exactly, but I would say that a common maybe theme is that this war is essentially being fought through wakala, so by proxy. So it maybe started off as our war, but is increasingly becoming not ours. And the sad thing is it's predominantly us dying, Libyans dying, and I don't expect this trend to change. It won't be Turks, Russians, Americans, Europeans dying. Unfortunately, Libya will predominantly be Libyan civilians that will be affected by the ongoing war, regardless of how much it is driven by foreign powers, or regardless how much it has become driven by foreign powers. So I would say it's maybe a sentiment of cynicism. And the other facet is maybe you have differences on the basis of where people live. So if you're talking about someone in Tripoli right now who's been living in Tripoli, like it's the case for my family and millions of other people, to be honest, they've become very frustrated. They just want a solution. They're looking sometimes hopeful at these conferences or at these Geneva talks or at the announcement of a ceasefire. They're waiting for someone to lend them a hand, basically, to help them out of the current crisis. But I honestly don't know what to say. It's very difficult to see signs that this will abate, that the current war will abate.
Given the last time you were in Libya, could you please tell us how the daily life is? Because how the daily life is, because you know, it's all we look at the map and there is this, you know, overall majority of the territory being taken over by one side, and there is this Tripoli stuck in one point. Is it almost like are the people also that divided, and how does it affect their daily life, this separation?
I think it's very difficult for a Libyan to explain sometimes what Libya is like to external players, to foreigners. But how daily life has been affected, let's say, by this war in Tripoli, where I come from, which is where I mostly go, is that you've got service delivery that was never good or never to an acceptable standard to begin with, that became completely bad or actually even absent to a certain extent. There aren't any services delivered. So rubbish is not being collected, the streets are not clean, if there's rain that causes floods, power is never there. I mean, it's cuts. Yesterday cut for 7 hours. Now with the oil blockade and the lack of actually fuel distributed to power stations, it might become a lot worse. So you might see power cuts for 20 hours plus. You had water cuts at the beginning of this war as well, sometimes, which are also affected by power supplies. So that's another issue. And since I would say August to September, the background of life for residents, for civilians, sound-wise, has become the sound of rockets. So it takes a psychological toll on you to be hearing that for almost a year now. And the other facet is that you have a lot of people that are displaced and that lost hope to a certain extent because they don't know, first of all, when they'll come back. They don't know if they can come back. They can't really check on their homes because they're at the front lines. And sometimes they would rather not check on them in fear of what they'll actually find. So really, it's a case-by-case basis, but it's, to be honest, very desolating. From a social fabric perspective, I think this is where this war is probably very, very problematic, because the problems and the narratives that it brings out are ones of division. So it's really, really dividing society. You have armed groups from all over the country that are currently involved in this current civil war. Despite the fact that it's foreign-led, as I said, it's Libyan-led on the ground. So that's the problem, I would say, with this current war, that socially speaking, it is causing damage that is, at this stage, from my perspective, irreversible. So if we are to deal with this, we'll not only have to have a security, economic, and political track, but we'll also have to have a social almost track, a reconciliation track, which is something that is almost never brought up or is seen as something that is maybe lovey-dovey, but it isn't, because that's also one of the facets of the current war.
True. But given this social psychology on the ground, what can you tell us about the popularity of Sarraj and Haftar?
I mean, it's very hard to gauge popularity of a person, but I mean, Sarraj was never elected, neither was Haftar. So, I mean, they were almost both, to a certain extent, imposed in one way or another on the population. And I don't honestly think that whatever phase comes next, they should be accommodated in, because they've clearly both displayed that they don't put the Libyan people in their interests first at the end of the day. One probably due to his corruption, and the other probably due to his thirst for power, I would say. That doesn't really care for how much his damage his war causes to a certain extent. So I don't, it's honestly very difficult for me to gauge popularity. You have differences even within certain families about what these figures should or represent. So I honestly can't judge that. But I will say that ultimately the fact that Haftar launched this offensive and that the fact that he's displaced thousands of people and the way this war has been conducted, really not with indiscriminate shelling, not differentiating between a migrant and a Libyan, not really caring if the rockets fall on residential areas, it's really somewhat tanked the narrative that Haftar's Libyan armed forces are an army that can bring the country together. Whereas for a lot of people, this was the case before. For a lot of residents of Tripoli, this might have been a better alternative than the militias they had. Now, I think they're probably disinterested in both models. But the problem is both models are almost, the two models are almost enforced on them from the outside.
So, thinking of Turkey's interference in Libya, it sounds like it's all defensive and it's almost, Turkey interest driven. How do you envision it? How could it have been different if it really wanted to assist a resolution in Libya?
I mean, obviously it's very easy to say this retrospectively to a certain extent. And also, I don't know how different Turkey could have approached it. I think, for example, the send-off of Syrian mercenaries wasn't a great decision because it both looks bad on the international stage, but it also looks bad to certain Libyan factions.
Why?
Because at the end of the day, what they expected was material support from Turkey, and what the expectation was from the defense agreement was that there would be an official, let's say, Turkish presence, not Syrian armed groups or Turkmen, for example. I think that was the expectation that they had.
There's a limited number of Turkish officers also.
There is a limited number of Turkish officers, of course, but predominantly the, let's say, covert aspect of the Turkish intervention is a high number of Syrian Turkmen sent into the country. And I won't just say, not the fact that they were sent off, but also the blueprint or the way they were sent off was not really transparent, which shows that both Turkey and to a certain extent also the GNA not everyone was really happy with this solution. But unfortunately, it seems to be the most practical one because Turkey has to factor in also domestic politics in its approach. So, for example, having Turkish casualties in Libya, and it's different than having Turkish casualties in Syria, where Syria is almost a bordering country to Turkey, and where the Turkish public is aware of why this intervention is happening. On the other hand, on the Turkish intervention in Libya, from what I've experienced here, is a lot of people don't understand why Turkey is intervening. There isn't broad-based acceptance for it, and already the perception is the Turkish intervention in Syria wasn't all that successful. So why are we doing this in a territory that's even farther from us, and which we de facto, as Turks, don't perceive that we have that much of a link to? And I think the way that it's dealt with as well by the Turkish apparatus is to appeal to this Ottoman idea, the links, etc., just for populist sentiment. But unfortunately, almost in a way plays into a bit the hand of the opposition in Turkey if it fails. Because at the end of the day, the way the Turkish intervention right now is framed is that if you're against it, then you're not patriotic in a way. with regards to Libya. But if it is failing, if it's a failed intervention, that causes a lot of problems for the AQP.
Some of the critics of the Erdogan government have raised that this intervention into Libya also had to do with the government's eagerness to fight a battle on behalf of Muslim Brotherhood, because they say that it has been a fought and lost battle in Egypt, in Syria, and Libya is one of the front. Is really Ikhwan, Muslim Brotherhood, that strong in Libya? Can that be one of the elements counted for Turkey's intervention?
So we have to differentiate two questions. So is it an element? Definitely yes. If the Muslim Brotherhood is that important in Libya, I wouldn't think so, and I don't think that Turkey would intervene this staunchly had it not had economic, business, commercial, maritime interest put first. And that's what they, at the end of the day, put first in the first place by signing the defense agreement and, more importantly, the maritime agreement. However, what's important is that it is an element. There is an ideological element to Turkey's intervention. At the end of the day, Turkey offers a model of governance that is different to the one in Egypt, to the one in the UAE, to the one in Saudi Arabia, whereby it allows political Islam to thrive, or it allows political Islam to coexist with others. And that's the model of governance that Turkey, despite being authoritarian, gives. And this has implications on Libya, but it also has implications on the wider region, really, because in Libya, that means that a neighboring state to Egypt would have this arrangement. So this would essentially be a footprint for Turkey to geopolitically expand out of North Africa. So it's a big thing. And the other precedent that it sets, if it is successful in its intervention or in this ideological precedent that it would want to set, it will also signal to other states in the region that this model of governance could be successful. Now, obviously, this is contingent on Turkey's intervention being successful in the first place, so it's a big if as well. But at the end of the day, right now, from my perspective, there isn't really a state involved in Libya that has managed to secure its medium to long-term interests, primarily because everything is driven by zero sum. So no one wants to sit down and have things and talk things out collectively, let's say. Turkey's effort was primarily bilateral. It was only with Russia. I think that also reflects an ideological proximity between the two. They're considered frenemies in a way. They label that cooperation on Syria. There is somewhat of a cooperation. And I think that they also think that they could replicate that in Libya. The problem is Haftar isn't Assad, in a way, first of all. Second of all, this doesn't really deal with Libya, with the root causes of the Libyan conflict, because none of these two states are really interested in state building, I would say. They don't have experience doing that. I don't see why they would have an incentive in going and doing that in the first place, jointly, whether jointly or just Turkey. So I guess we'll see, but from my perspective, unless there's a collective effort and Libyan buy-in, it'll be very difficult to get out of the Libyan buy-in.
Interesting that you mentioned Assad, because I was going to ask whether you think Russia had any kind of overarching control over Haftar compared to other, partners in the game. So really because we've seen Haftar stepping out of the meeting in Moscow and just saying, I'm not doing this. Mm-hmm. So what does it tell about Russia's influence over Haftar?
Well, I mean, we have to dissect a little bit how Russia operates. From my perspective, Russia operates by creating almost relationships of dependency between them and other actors. That's as valid for Assad as it is for Haftar. They've tried to create a relationship of dependency between them. Now, obviously, on Haftar's side, there was a Russian presence before this conflict, but it wasn't as widespread as it was, or as it became, let's say, since August 2019. And I think they may have partly, first of all, overestimated the relationship of dependency that they created on Haftar, partly because he has a lot of other foreign backers. But at the end of the day, I also think that Turkey somewhat overestimated the incentive that really Russia had to strain relationships with Haftar's backers, namely the UAE, the Saudis, the Egyptians, etc. Because why would it do that? And that's part of the reason why these, let's say, intertwined dynamics are part of the reason why Haftar could afford to actually walk out on Putin's ceasefire in Moscow. But again, Haftar is not perceived as Assad by the Russians. He's not considered a solution by the Russians. However, he is considered a pedestal for more geopolitical clout in North Africa and in Libya in particular, and which has worked out quite well for them, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. And as a Libyan and as someone who's been following the conflict from day one, do you expect this conflict to escalate any further, or do you, in your perception of the things, has it reached the moment and from now on there has to be a solution?
Well, you've never reached the moment, unfortunately. I think there's this perception amongst European policymakers that the flow of weapons and mercenaries, this, let's say, escalation without there being an active conflict or an active confrontation or an offensive by either of the parties, will nicely lead into a balance. But I think that's a very flawed and naive, actually, assumption, because at the end of the day, those feeding the conflict, whether it be Turkey, Russia, the UAE, etc., they're not the ones affected by it. And it assumes three things. It assumes, first of all, that the Libyan parties really care about the escalations, which some of them definitely have shown that they do not, that it's a very zero-sum game. It also assumes that the foreign backers are affected and that they would have any incentive to de-escalate. And it also underplays how lucrative this war is, because it is very lucrative for a lot of states, whether involved or not involved, primarily those involved, actually. So I think this assumption really has created a false approach to tackling the Libya conflict, where, okay, let's see, they keep sending weapons, let's see if they'll actually realize they should sit down. But they don't really have a reason to if you don't coerce them into it. So unless coercion is applied, both on the international and domestic actors, I unfortunately do not foresee this stopping. And it's a very worrying expectations. The complacency is really tiresome sometimes.
Okay. So my reading is, as long as there is an implemented, unless there is an implemented arms embargo effective in Libya, you don't see.
Yeah, I mean that's what's almost troubling, and that's what I think is causing a bit of disillusionment in the UN Security Council, is that there is the legal, let's say, apparatus, or the legal framework to actually have an embargo exists. We shouldn't be discussing whether to enforce it or not when it's illegal to break it. That's a pointless discussion to have. So essentially, Berlin, by failing to actually even allude to that, to make it even binding to not break the arms embargo, it was a failure to begin with, as soon as that wasn't there, or it wasn't directly put into a UN Security Council resolution. But yeah, if there isn't a medium through which foreign interventionists would be tapered and the arms embargo would be committed to, which it should, then I don't foresee this stopping, unfortunately.
Sorry to hear that, but thank you very much for all your input, and hope to meet you on another occasion.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching us.